Ukrainian contact group. It's held on Ramstein Air Force Base. It's basically where Ukraine's Ministry of Defense gets together with their U.S., NATO, and European counterparts, and they talk about what kind of military assistance Ukraine needs. Ukraine had been pitching very heavily, basically the need to rebuild an entire new army. The one that NATO had built starting in May of 2022, the one that had the success in Kharkov and Kherson, was destroyed. It was slaughtered on the battlefield. That's the price you pay when attacking Russians, who are pretty good at defense. So they needed a new army. And they were telling basically they said, look, we can get this thing done, but we need 300 tanks, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 artillery pieces, lots of ammunition. Well, the one thing they didn't say they needed were F-16 fighters. I'll just point that out. General Zelensky in December told The Economist, I'm not talking about F-16s, just give me what I need and I can do what I need to do. And so NATO did a lot of wrangling. There was a lot of hemming and hawing. Are they going to provide Leopards? Are the Germans going to provide Leopards? Who's going to be the first one to put tanks on the table? But at the end of the day, they got the equipment there, and then NATO started training the Ukrainians. The hope, I think, was that Ukraine would start this counteroffensive sometime in early May, but they weren't able to. I think a combination of weather and just getting the resources they needed, assembled and to the front. They were able to start this counteroffensive on June 8th. There were a lot of pressure from NATO because NATO had put a lot of markers on the table, so to speak, saying, okay, we're going to do this, but you need to accomplish that. Because I think there's growing fatigue in NATO, sort of Ukraine fatigue. The bottom line is NATO stripped its arsenal bare. There's really not much left for them to give without really, eating into the meat of NATO itself, reducing NATO's combat efficiency. And some would say, in certain nations like Germany, that they have already done that. That Germany has basically made it itself incapable of carrying out large-scale ground combat in Europe type operations. They don't have the resources to do that. And even nations that claim to have it, they'll run out of ammo in a week, 10 days, less, including the United States, by the way. So people are telling Ukrainians, there's really not much more we can do for you. This one, you really have to get something done. You need to hurt the Russians so badly that they will sue for peace. And we need you to do it, here's the big one, in time for the Vilnius summit. Now, the important thing about this is that if you take a look at the Russians, they have never been calendar driven. The Russians have never once said, we need to take X by Y. They just say, we need to take X. And when we take it, we take it. NATO, on the other hand, has put these artificial time constraints on Ukraine, saying you need to have this big, thing done by July 11th, and as a result, the Ukrainians basically ran. They advertised what they were going to do in December 2022. General Zelensky said, "We need to march 84 kilometers to Melitopol, which is a city in the I think it's the if it's not Donetsk, then it's in Kherson or Zaporizhia, one of those. But it's on the land bridge. They're 84 kilometers away. If they get to Melitopol, they cut the major highway connecting Crimea with Russia. And if they can get there, they can then apply firepower on the Crimean isthmus, cutting it off, and then pushing forward to Mariupol, a city that we're all familiar with. This is what they had said they're going to do. They said, if you give us this equipment, this is what we're going to do. Now, if you take a look at the front lines, that means that there's a certain frontage that they're going to be attacking on to accomplish this. That just happens to be where Russia built some of its most extensive defenses, designed by a general who specializes in defensive warfare. They took him out of the academy where he designed it and had him build it and then command the troops that are there. So none of this was, this is not a surprise. This isn't the Battle of the Bulge where the Germans come through the Ardennes and the Americans go, oh my God, where'd they come from? Russians were waiting for them. In come the Ukrainians, and they don't even get the first base. They get slaughtered. They're the vaunted Leopard tank, the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. They're all just butchered on the battlefield. Huge casualties. They are forced to withdraw. They keep trying it, doesn't work. So what the Ukrainians did is stop using what they call NATO tactics, even though they weren't really doing them right. And they started going into more small infantry unit infiltration tactics, trying to work their way through the minefields and then take one trench and then move in forward, take another trench. They had a little bit more success, meaning they got further into the Russian defenses. But in the end of the day, they were hit by artillery and forced to withdraw. High casualties, very high casualties. At the NATO summit, basically NATO confronted Ukraine with the reality that this isn't gonna hack it. We're not happy with the results. We're not happy with what you've done. And they pretty much, all these words about we're here for you, but you're never going to be a member ever. And we're by the way, there's not much more we can do for you. We'll support you, except we're not going to support you. You saw the sort of iconic photograph of the summit where Zelensky and his Winston Churchill olive drab "I'm a warrior leader" outfit is standing by himself with a very bitter look on his face, while all the tuxedo-clad political elite are over here talking to each other. Even his wife, who's dressed in a gown, is away from him. He's truly isolated, and that's Vilnius in a nutshell. Total isolation. He came out and he was told, "You have to perform. You have to." And so now he's ordered his army back in. And the German intelligence published leaked a report, an assessment that took the Ukrainians to task for walking away from NATO, from the training they received from NATO. And so Zelensky said, not only must you redouble your attacks, but you have to do it the way NATO trained you to do it, or else no one's going to ever train us again. Why would they train us if we ignore the training? And so right back into the front, here they come. Hey, diddle, diddle, straight up the middle. And they're getting slaughtered. I mean, they have enough mass when they come in, with 20 tanks, 30 infantry fighting vehicles, they can blow their way through a minefield and they can make it to the first village. And then they're done. They proclaim a great victory. Hey, we captured a village. Yeah, but you're still in the gray zone. You're still in the crumple zone. You're still in the flexible defense zone. You haven't reached the first line of defense, and you're stopped, and you're getting hit with artillery, and you're withdrawing. And that's the reality right now. The casualties are mind-boggling. You remember that Zelensky asked for 300 tanks. Estimates are that Ukraine's lost close to 400 tanks since June 8th. He asked for 500 infantry fighting vehicles. Ukraine is estimated to have lost 1,300 armored vehicles and vehicles of that nature. Their artillery is decimated. Yes, they still have some reserves left that they're going to throw into this fight, but the Ukrainian army is broken. It's destroyed. There's not really any hope for it. There never was any hope for it, but they're not putting the pain on Russia like they thought they were going to put. And for the Ukrainians, this is a very, it's tragic. It's utterly tragic that this is happening. In some ways, though, I'll quote Dmitry Medvedev, who you don't normally quote if you're trying to do anything other than trolling. But he this morning he said, NATO should pay attention to what they're asking the Ukrainians to do, because if you're asking the Ukrainians to defeat us and strip away our territories, what you're saying is you want a nuclear war, and there will be a nuclear war. Our doctrine says when you present us with an existential threat, we will respond with nuclear weapons. So the best thing NATO can do is pray for the victory of our brave Russian troops, because that will save them from, a nuclear holocaust. And he's right. He's 100% right. The good news is the Russians are winning. So there's no worry about Ukraine stripping away Russian territories and Russia having to use nuclear weapons. But it just shows you how utterly stupid this entire conflict is, and how ill prepared the West is to deal with, what's happening and what's going to happen. I mean, you remember Jan Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, has been saying for some time now that the defeat of Ukraine will be the defeat of NATO. Well, wake up, NATO! You just got beat. You've been beat. Now, what are you going to do about it? Do you want to go to war with what? You have nothing left. You gave everything to the Ukrainians. It's been chewed up. You talk big about how much money you're going to use to invest in building the military. Where's the money coming from? German economy's in free fall. French economy's in free fall. The British economy's in free fall. The Italian economy's treading water. Where's the money going to come from? With what industrial capacity? You can't afford the energy, which means you can't afford the production processes necessary to smelt the steel you need to produce these weapons. You don't have access to the raw materials. I mean, literally, Europe lives in this fantasy world of expectations that are not going to be met by reality.
Well, those are all very good points. I want to pull back up the article because you had, I think this is really well said. You said Ukraine will never be the same after this war ends. Neither will the NATO alliance. Having defined the proxy war it's waging in Ukraine against Russia in existential terms, NATO will struggle to find both relevance and purpose in the post-conflict world. And that the Vilnius summit on July 11th and 12th in many ways represented the high water mark of Europe's old order. And it's the requiem of a nightmare of Europe's own creation, the death of a nation, the nullification of a continent, and the end of an order which had long ago lost its legitimacy. Could you elaborate on these points, perhaps? Because I think that's very well said. I think it certainly hits the mark of what's going on. But yeah, if you could elaborate on that.
Well, certainly. When we speak of Europe's order, it's an order that was manufactured in the aftermath of the Second World War, especially Western Europe. It was manufactured out of the ashes of Germany's defeat and the consequences of that defeat, meaning, France had been occupied, fought through, destroyed. Italy, bombed. The lowlands, the Benelux countries, devastated. England itself in ruins. Norway, occupied, devastated. Europe lay in ruins. And, through the Marshall Plan and through, NATO, the United States was able to not only rebuild Europe, but bring a certain relevance to Europe. Europe had a purpose now, purpose-driven existence, which was to stand up against the evil of the Soviet Union, of communism. An iron curtain had descended upon Europe, if you remember Winston Churchill's Fulton, Missouri speech in 1946. And so this is the order. And then this order, it's what the United States calls the rules-based international order. And Europe bought into it. Europe is part of the rules-based international order. The G7, the group of 7 nations is, primarily European. If you take a look at, who runs the IMF, the World Bank, et cetera, heavy European presence. Europe is dominating the world as sort of the puppet of the United States, which is, of course, sits at the top of the pyramid. This is the old European order, and it's modified at the end of the Cold War. A couple things happen. One, Europe needs to make a decision. Where are they going to go with the Soviet Union gone? What is Europe going to look like? They could have opted to be part of a change, a process of change that would adapt to a new world order. They didn't. They opted to continue the old regime. They continue the rules-based international order, to continue promoting American hegemony. But they did so by expanding into Eastern Europe to absorb the territories of Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, the former Warsaw Pact territories. So this is the old order. It dates back to the end of the Second World War. And it had lost relevance. I mean, NATO has been, since the end of the Cold War, an organization struggling for relevance. Why do we exist? That's one of those fundamental existential questions. For what reason? The Soviet threat is no more. Why do we exist? And in the struggle to define themselves, they started doing things that they're not supposed to do, like become an offensive military alliance. NATO is a defensive, exclusively defensive military alliance, but suddenly they're carrying out wars of aggression against Serbia. They greenlit the invasion of Afghanistan and the occupation of Afghanistan. NATO, under Article 4, became heavily involved in Afghanistan. Even though they didn't sign on to the Iraq War, NATO members were part of the invasion, and NATO then created an Iraq training group afterwards, which is sort of saying, we approve of the conflict. We're there with you to rebuild this post-conflict nation. And then 2011 and NATO's regime change war against Libya. NATO has fundamentally changed. One of the things that I think shook NATO to the core was the experience in Afghanistan. For 2 decades, NATO stepped up when the United States asked them to. NATO nations went to Afghanistan. Some of them got heavily involved in combat in Afghanistan, suffered casualties as a result, and they redefined their entire defense approach towards low-intensity conflict nation building. They stopped talking about tanks and aircraft and all that, and they started talking about how we train light infantry units, logistical units, the units we need to send to Afghanistan. And then in 2021, they were left hanging. In early 2021, the U.S. was doing the old tin cup routine, going around NATO saying, we need money, we need you to donate, Afghanistan support mission, we'll never leave Afghanistan, trust us, we're America, we're here for the long haul, and all this kind of stuff. And so NATO's sitting there pouring money in, rotating troops in, and all of a sudden, August 21, America's out. And NATO's going, what the heck just happened? You were abandoned, you were lied to. And so NATO now is an organization in absolute flux. They're trying to say, can we trust America ever again? And are we a legitimate, military alliance? What's going on? Enter the Ukrainian conflict, and NATO buys into it. They use tensions with Russia to create a new sense of relevancy, a new reason to exist, and they bought into it 100%. They didn't think about the consequences. Again, Jan Stoltenberg said that this is an existential struggle. If Ukraine loses, NATO loses. Ukraine was never going to win, ever. They were never going to win. And the one hope NATO had is that they would be able to, as part of a global effort to sanction Russia into self-immolation, that Russia could not survive the sanctions, collapse, lead to domestic unrest, and the Putin regime is gone, and as a result, they can't sustain the fight in Ukraine. They must withdraw. That was always their hope. But they never even got traction on that. Sanctions never took off. They never had the impact they wanted. Russia was always one step ahead. I've talked to some Russians, and they will tell me, because I called it back in before the war happened in December. I'm like, no, this isn't. Russia's going to have this thing beat hands down. And I was confidently expressing, and everything was happening exactly the way I said it was going to happen. But I've had Russian analysts come up and go, hey, Scott, don't pat yourself on the back too much, pal. Because, while it all looked like what you were saying is happening, it was harder than you think. It was touch and go for a while. There was a lot of uncertainty. The Kremlin was not certain about this at all. There were a lot of people in the Kremlin saying our economy can shrink to 20-25%. And there was a lot of concern about what that would do to the domestic political situation. So even though my track record on the sanctions is 100%, as an analyst, I sort of have to reflect on what they told me and say, maybe I got lucky, and maybe Russia got lucky. Who knows? The bottom line is they beat them on sanctions. And the sanctions blew back on Europe, just like I predicted it would. And Europe's paying the price. So this is literally the end of the old order in Europe. It's done. The high watermark. Europe will never be as powerful as it was at Vilnius. And the power in Vilnius was largely superficial. It was largely, propaganda, a lot of spinning, because the reality is their power's been eroding for decades. When they went to Afghanistan, they stopped doing large-scale ground combat. They stopped training to be NATO the way it used to be. They can't do it anymore. That's just the sad fact. Europe cannot fight the war that Ukraine is fighting today in Ukraine. The Ukrainian army is literally the second most powerful army in Europe. If the Ukrainians stopped fighting the Russians, pivoted, and started heading west, they could blow through Poland like that and be in Berlin in a couple of weeks. And there's nothing the Poles or the Germans could do to stop them. Nothing. Because they don't have militaries capable of doing this kind of fight. Not at all. The only army that can stand up to Ukrainians right now is the Russians. And it's not easy for the Russians. This is hard work that the Russians are doing. But so that's what's going on. Ukraine. Ukraine is an interesting nation with an interesting history, and we're not going to get into that right now. But what I will say is that Ukraine had been positioning itself to be an important agricultural center, important industrial center. It was, important to Russia, important enough for the collective West to try and strip it away from Russia, part of their plan of bringing Russia down. But Ukraine had a vision for how it would interact with the West, and the West indeed was looking for how to integrate Ukraine. The Ukrainian nation's done, finished. It will never be what it was, ever. I mean, they've lost Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk. They will never get that back. They will never get Crimea back. And if this war continues on, there's a chance they may lose more territories, although I personally believe that Russia would prefer not to be compelled to complicate things by taking that. In order for Ukraine to survive as a nation state, it needs access to the Black Sea. And so Russia stripping Odessa away from Ukraine would be a horrible blow to the Ukrainian nation. The people of Odessa, it's historically a Russian city, but and many of the population would like to be part of Russia, but getting Russian troops in Odessa in the numbers necessary to control it, it's not that easy. The bridge is down in Kherson. Basically, the Russians are going to have to take Kharkov, then pivot, come down the right bank of the Dnieper, and then get into Odessa that way. And that's going to require, frankly speaking, more troops than they currently have. Russia has sufficient troops right now to do what they're doing, which is to defeat the Ukrainian army on the totality of the length of the line of contact. But what happens when Russia starts pushing in? You start creating those bulges. Those bulges require troops, not only along the line of contact, but in the depth, especially as you move into territories where you might have populations that will be hostile to Russia. So it's not as easy as just drawing a big arrow on the map. And Russia doesn't have those resources. But nonetheless, Ukraine can't keep this fight up indefinitely. It's not just that Russia might take Kharkov and Odessa. There's talk right now that Poland might carve out or seek to carve out Western Ukraine, Lvov. And if they do that, then the Hungarians have some claim on the Carpathians. The Romanians have some claim. The knives are out. Ukraine's getting carved up. And what's going to be left? Ukraine has committed suicide, national suicide. So that's what I meant by that. It's the death of Ukraine. It's the end of the old European order. Now, the question is what's going to emerge from this, what the future is going to hold. And the bottom line is Europe's going to have to learn to live. I don't know if you saw what just happened today. I alluded to it in my article, but I didn't see that it was going to be Hungary that would sink the Swedish NATO dreams. But the Hungarian parliament just said, thumbs down, ain't going to happen on our watch. And that's it. Sweden's done. Turkey was going to consider it sometime in October. They just made this easy for Turkey because now Turkey feels no political pressure at all. So this unified NATO isn't unified at all. It's a fractured NATO. Another reason why Turkey may not approve it is that they were promised F-16 fighters, sort of a bribe to bring it in. But looks like Biden's reneging on that promise. Why? Because Greece is concerned. Why is Greece concerned? They're a NATO member, aren't they? Well, Greece and Turkey don't get along. And Greece is worried that Turkey will use those F-16s to go to war against it. Wait a minute. That's a NATO country going to war against a NATO country. What happened to NATO unity? I thought NATO was one big happy family. They're not. They're not. And that's what I meant by high watermark. This is it, guys. It's the beginning of the end. As the European elite start to get replaced, and they're being replaced as we speak, we see one after another, the political elites are getting voted out of office. new bloods being put forward. I think this is going to fundamentally change Europe. Their economies have to adapt. They're going to have to adapt to the new geopolitical reality of Russia. France is in big trouble right now, not because of Russia, that was always the case, but because of Africa. France is going through an existential crisis in Africa that, if you know anything about how the French economy works, you have to understand that the French economy is getting gutted as we speak, as they lose their colonial base in Africa. So, France is in trouble. Germany's tanking. Italy's in crisis. It's over for Europe, literally. I mean, it will always be there. It's on a map. It exists. These countries exist, but the day of European grandeur is finished. And gradually, Europe's going to be losing its global relevance. It used to be that the G7 meant something, but the G7 is supposed to be the world's 7 most influential economies. Well, who's not in the G7? China, Russia, India. You know where they are? They're in a thing called BRICS. And BRICS apparently is going to be, they've already exceeded in terms of their purchasing power parity. Adjusted GDP is already above that of the G7, but soon you're not even going to have to play that game because all the economies of the G7, with the exception of the United States, apparently, are tanking.
Yeah, indeed. And I wanted to flesh out these divisions within NATO a bit more because, as you said, I don't even think the ruling party of Hungary showed up for that vote at all. So there actually wasn't even a vote on Sweden's accession. And of course, it took months and months and months to get Turkey to agree. Turkey demanded a lot of concessions from the EU, from the United States. You mentioned the F-16s. He demanded EU membership. Pipe dream, never going to happen, but he demanded it. And of course, that vote that's supposed to happen for Turkey was supposed to happen in October. But Hungary's rejection, as you said, means Turkey doesn't really have to do much because it is consensus. And so if all NATO members aren't for it, it doesn't really matter what Turkey's position is. So these divisions within NATO, how come? Like, why are they coming up? The conflict obviously plays a huge role, but what do these divisions really show about NATO? What do they tell us?
Well, these divisions aren't new. Throughout NATO's formative period, you had 3 nations that were competing to be the principal power, number 2 power behind the United States. You had the French, the British, and the Germans. The French sort of opted out militarily, and the de Gaulle pulled them out. So France removed itself from the equation back then. So it was basically Germany and the United Kingdom. But then you got to remember, NATO doesn't exist in a vacuum. NATO exists as sort of the political military arm of what became the European Union. The European Union is the political economic arm. And Germany is dominant in the European Union. The German economy, the German banking system is dominant. And there you have a definite fracture between Germany and France because there's different economic models. The Germans are more tight-fisted conservative banking, and the French are sort of liberal free spending kind of people. And never the two shall meet. And so there's this friction between France and Germany that's real, and it exists during this whole time. Together, France and Germany still represent something that, when I say this, you'll know where I'm going with it, old Europe. Because Donald Rumsfeld in 2003, or 2002 actually, chided old Europe because old Europe wasn't buying into the Iraq mess. Old Europe wasn't going to go and invade Iraq. And so Donald Rumsfeld was talking about old Europe and New Europe. And what was New Europe? New Europe are the Eastern European countries that we were bribing, that we were blackmailing, that we were doing whatever it takes to coerce them onto our side. So already in 2002, 2003, you're seeing a fractured old Europe having new fractures created as they create New Europe. New Europe wasn't this natural growth. New Europe were these artificial appendages jammed on by the United States into NATO. So you have that going on already. As NATO expanded and kept moving on, these fractures grew deeper because, for instance, as NATO made a decision to make Russia the focal point, nations like the three Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, suddenly have relevance that's well beyond their size. They've become sort of the center. NATO is forming battle groups to go work in the Baltics, and that makes the Baltics feel like they're really big and they're important. Poland is starting to say, we should be the center of NATO's attention, not Germany. Why is Germany getting all the attention? We're the ones that are on the front line. We need the attention. And then down south, Romania is going, hey, don't forget about me. Don't forget about me. I count. I'm here on the Black Sea. I count. And so you have different NATOs. The thing is, it's 32 nations now. I mean, Finland got added, but let's go back for it, 31, then 30. Back when it was 29 nations, you still had it. It's a consensus-driven organization that almost can't make consensus on too much of note. Compromises have to be made, and compromises weaken, not strengthen. Compromises mean that you're not doing that which needs to be done. And NATO was an organization already starting to fall apart, even before the debacle in Afghanistan. They weren't spending the money they needed to spend. Donald Trump called them out on that. You don't have to like Donald Trump, but you do have to respect the fact that on this issue, he was dead on accurate. The United States was carrying NATO. And that's it. And that's the truth. NATO was just along for the ride. They weren't doing what they needed to be done. And now you have this conflict with Ukraine. I think there were many nations in NATO that understood that they were living a lie. I mean, I'll tell you definitely who understood. The Germans understood. Why? Because Angela Merkel has admitted that the Minsk Accords 2014 deal was a sham to buy time so that NATO could build an army. So she knew in her heart of hearts that when NATO and the United States were trying to spin the Ukraine crisis as all Russia's fault, she knew that was a lie. You know who else knew it was a lie? The French. Francois Hollande did the same thing. He told the lies. Emmanuel Macron knew it was a lie, and yet they're spinning it. But they know it's a lie. Everybody in NATO knew that what they're doing is a lie. Only a couple had the courage to speak out. Turkey spoke out. Turkey said that the reason why they're not going to jump on sanctions is they say this is a war that NATO brought onto itself. Turkey didn't say Russia's to blame. They said NATO brought it on themselves. Now, Turkey is also playing both sides. They're providing help to Ukraine because it's a sovereign state. But they're saying NATO started this fight. Hungary, NATO started this fight. So there's not a tremendous amount of unity in NATO because NATO's not an organization that was crafted. If you want something like an organization like NATO to have unity, it needs to grow organically. Things have to grow naturally. People have to join naturally. But the United States was bribing nations to join NATO. We were coercing them to join NATO. The Eastern European nations were brought in and appended onto NATO, like Frankenstein's monster. And they were done. It was done specifically so that they would support the United States. So they would support the United States and its adventures abroad. Whereas old Europe was saying, I don't know if we really want to be doing that. But then when New Europe started supporting it, then old Europe said, well, we've got to get on board. And so it's with only begrudgingly that they get on board. But again, they're not spending the money on defense. They don't have militaries worthy of the support. NATO is just it's a deeply diseased organization. It's sick, and it can't be cured. There's no cure for NATO. There's nothing that can be done to turn this around. NATO is literally on. I said they reached their high water mark. And if you study the American Civil War, they call the Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg the high water mark of the Confederacy. Well, that took place on January 3rd or July 3rd, 1863. War didn't end until April 1865. So even though when you reach your high water mark doesn't mean it's all over. that means there's still a lot of stuff going to happen. NATO's going to be around for a while. It's going to take some time to unpack the NATO debacle, but I think you're going to be seeing in the years to come, Europe starting to talk about a European security alliance that is separate from the United States. That they're a little worn out with being America's toy dog, and I think Europe's going to start to say we need to look out for our own best interests, especially when they're paying 5 times or 3 to 5 times the amount for natural gas than they would be if they had been buying the Russian stuff. And it's funny, the Europeans, how silly can they be? The America, we don't want you to be over-reliant on Russian gas. You should not be over-reliant on any single source of gas, unless it's American gas, and then you must be over-reliant on us. And, because right now the script's been flipped. They're over-reliant on American gas. They need American gas. But the difference is Russia never put any preconditions on its gas. America is nothing but precondition.
Yes, and that's the truth. Well, speaking of diseased and maybe irredeemable the developments, features, let's talk about leaders. Vladimir Zelensky, as Joe Biden called him. Let's talk about him, because first, you have a series that you've been doing that I didn't get to finish because it was taken down, I believe, on YouTube. I don't know if it is back up, called Agent Zelensky. So definitely you could talk about that, but also in the article that you wrote for Consortium News, you also talk about, and maybe I'll pull up the photo that I don't know if you chose this or they used, because it was a very, I think this is a great photo as well. Here's Zelensky at the summit. I think it speaks volumes for the relationship, but while NATO may be around for a while, as you said, Scott, as you referenced, Zelensky, I'm a little less sure, but he continues to be very vocal, even today in Brazilian media. I believe it was Globo Media. He was talking about how nothing's ever good enough if we haven't won yet. If the conflict is continuing, nothing that the West does, nothing that NATO does is good enough for us. So talk about maybe this Zelensky phenomenon. What is significant about this? Because at the NATO summit, as you said in the article, he was kind of on display. He was an internet meme. Everyone was sharing the photo of him putting mops in his hand, doing all kinds of things, because he was so lonely. But at the same time, he keeps talking. He talks. I say this all the time on the program, I really haven't seen if it is truly a puppet master relationship, if it is truly NATO, the United States, hold the influence, I haven't seen a puppet speak like this to its masters so publicly, vocally, so admonishingly, like just very, and it makes me wonder, one, how long does Zelensky really have? Two, your take on everything that's been going on with him being front and center, the face of this conflict, as it's been going along.
Sure. Well, first of all, I did do a 2-part series called Agent Zelensky. I don't want to take too much credit for it. I'm the what they call the talent. Although I did have a role in conceiving it and in shaping it. I was approached by an independent documentary film company, and they had the idea, and we spent many hours on the phone talking about this. We talked about who could be interviewed, etc. I thought initially that I was just going to be one of the people interviewed. I thought I was just going to go up, get interviewed, and that my interview gets spliced into the film. And then they came back and said, no, we want you to host it. And I said, well, that's a whole different ballgame. I've never done that before. So I needed to be a little bit more hands-on in terms of script development and things of that nature. But, they did the interviews. We wrote the script, and then I did it. And I have to say the end product surprised me. It was very professional, very well done. And I was a little nervous, to be honest. I was nervous because I had done a documentary film before, In Shifting Sands, about Iraq, but I was the writer, director, producer. So I was familiar with every second of that film, why it's going in, why we're doing what we're doing, etc. And this one, you sort of have to trust them. I mean, you sit there and say, "Hey, I'd like you interview this person, and we'll focus on this, and we'll focus on that." And so they had all the pieces, but now once I did my talking head routine, it's over to them, and they're the ones piecing it together with the final production say. And you don't know what it's going to look like coming out. You don't know if suddenly you're going to be, Mr. Propaganda, or looking like a doofus or whatever. I have to say they did a fantastic job, and I'm deeply grateful for their professionalism and for their work. And I think it's a valuable documentary. I think what it does is it shows a different side of the story when it comes to Zelensky. Here in the West, we're told that he's, of course, the modern day incarnation of Winston Churchill. He's Mr. Democracy. We're one of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing is he is us. He's over there. He's us. He's an extension of us. He's about freedom and democracy, and nothing could be further from the truth. This is not a democratic leader. This is not a Winston Churchill figure. He's a comedian. Not bad. I mean, I watched Servant of the People, entertaining series. He deserves any credit he can get out of that. But what you learn in watching that and then digging more is that it's so much more than a TV series. Servant of the People was information warfare. It was designed on purpose to shape the minds of the Ukrainian audience, to get them to see Volodymyr Zelensky as the president of Ukraine. That was the whole purpose of it. This was an intelligence-driven operation, and the powers behind it are oligarchs controlled by British MI6. And that's why it's called Agent Zelensky, because he is literally an agent of British intelligence. And then we go through in the film making more, we back that up further. But it's important to know that this is a man who is playing a role. And it's a role written by others. And we know this. I mean, it's not speculation. To give you an example, one of the more glaring examples, when the conflict started early on, if you remember, people were saying, hey, the United States or the British need to fly him out, get him out of Ukraine, save his life. And suddenly you get this headline, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And everybody's like, whoa, man, what a dude, what a guy. Zelensky's a man, he's rocking dude. And suddenly he's wearing the olive green. Everybody's like, he's a warrior. He's a warrior prince. He's a Zen master. He's everything. What they didn't realize is the CIA letter admitted that Zelensky never said that it was written by a CIA officer working at the U.S. Embassy, and they released it as a Zelensky quote, but he didn't say it. And that's the reality of Zelensky. Everything he does is scripted. Everything he does is scripted, except when he goes off script. Now, why do actors go off script? You see this oftentimes in Hollywood, where a guy comes in, he's brought out of nowhere, he's given a script, a role, and man, he hits it. It's his Oscar. Got his Oscar in his hand, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm a great actor." No, you just had one role and you read a good script. But now he comes into the next movie, and and suddenly he wants to freelance.